All right, guys, welcome back to Unit 12. The nation begins to crack, the sectional crisis of the 1840s. If you remember what we're doing here, we're breaking the Unit 12 down into three. Part one, we talked about the Texas Revolution and about how the revolution brought up again once more the question of whether or not slavery should expand, the arguments that arose between the North and the South over the annexation of Texas, and that was all a result of the Revolution. Then in part two, we talked about the Mexican-American War. We talked about the origins of the war itself, but more important, what we focused on was how that war, once again, brought up the question of slavery's expansion into the territories. And that was a result of all the territory that we gained as a result of that war. Well, now in part three, we're going to talk about the crisis that it created here in the 1840s. We needed to know the Texas Revolution. We needed to know the Mexican-American War to lay the groundwork for this very real, very potentially dangerous crisis here of the 1840s. So just to kind of the Mexican War is going to reopen the question that's going to lead to the American Civil War, and it is going to create, by the 1840s, a very real sectional crisis. There were other issues, though, going on in the United States that was creating this crisis. So after we discuss the big one, the expansion of slavery into the Mexican Cession, we're also going to talk about some smaller issues dividing both North and South. And then we'll talk about the compromise that seemingly settled all these issues and the significance of that compromise. Now look, the biggest issue facing the United States after the Mexican-American War was the question of slavery's expansion into these new territories gained as a result of the war. Those new territories are all together called the Mexican Cession. And that's what we really want to focus on here, the expansion of slavery into these territories. Now, the way we're going to approach this is I'm going to give you the northern answer to this question and the northern attitude towards this question, and then I'm going to give you the southern attitude and the southern answer to this question, and then we're going to briefly talk about kind of a middle of the road answer to this question, because the northern argument to address this question is a very far extreme, so is the southern one, and we also see kind of a middle of the road here answer to this question. But let's cover the northern attitude towards the question of whether or not slavery should expand into the Mexican Cession. The northern attitude is all embodied in what is known as the Wilmot Proviso. And guys, all a proviso is an attachment to a law. And in 1846, when the Mexican-American War first began, a man by the name of David Wilmot, who was a senator from Pennsylvania, as part of a bill that was going to fund the war effort, he attached an addition to it, a proviso to it. And what this proviso basically stated was this, that any territory gained as a result of the Mexican-American War, that slavery would be barred. It would be prohibited from going there. And what we see in this proviso is Wilmot, and he is backed by the majority of northern congressmen, making the case that Congress should prohibit slavery's expansion into the territories gained as a result of the Mexican War. And as part of this argument, what you see is Northerners using not only precedent as evidence to support themselves, but also the United States Constitution. Let me explain that. Wilmot and his supporters would have argued that Congress should prohibit slavery's expansion into the territories, and that Congress has the right to do this because of precedent. And we've already seen this twice in the course, with the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, but also with the Missouri Compromise. Both of those were cases in which Congress did restrict the expansion of slavery into the territories. So he argues that we have precedent on our side here, and that Congress should be able to do this. But number two, they argued that the United States Constitution gives Congress the right to do this, because the Constitution does state that the federal government, that the United States Congress, is the supreme authority within the territories. So see, what the North is arguing here via the Wilmot Proviso is that not only should slavery not go into the territories, but that Congress has the right to do it. Congress has the right to restrict it because of precedent and because the United States Constitution gives Congress the power to govern the territories any way it seems fit. So bottom line here, what you wind up with as a result of the Mexican-American War is kind of a hardening of the Northern attitude towards the question of slavery's expansion. And for the North, it has now become a matter of principle that slavery is not to expand and that Congress should act to stop it. And you see that through the Wilmot Proviso of 1846. The next year, in 1847, we kind of get the Southern answer to this question of whether or not slavery should expand. And it comes in the form of a series of resolutions read on the floor of the United States Senate by our old friend from South Carolina, John C. Calhoun. He is not looking well. Calhoun's response to the Northern answer, Calhoun's response to the Wilmot Proviso does represent the Southern answer, the Southern attitude towards slavery's expansion. And what Calhoun's going to argue through these Senate resolutions is that Congress has absolutely no right to restrict the expansion of slavery into the territories. In fact, Congress can't do this. Why? Because according to Calhoun, the Constitution protects an individual's property. That's all in the Fifth Amendment. You cannot be deprived of your property without due process, meaning you break a law. What he's arguing here is that the Constitution protects property, slaves are considered property, and so to Calhoun and to the South, if Congress restricts the expansion of slavery, they will see this as a violation of their constitutional rights. They'll see it as a violation of their Fifth Amendment. Now, this is a pretty damn good argument, but so is David Wilmot's argument. Therein lies the problem. So bottom line here, for the South, it is now a matter of principle that slavery should be allowed to expand, that Congress cannot stop it, and if they try to do it, the South sees it as unconstitutional. And see, these are matters of principle now. These are not matters of opinion anymore. These are matters of principle. The North is of the opinion that slavery should not expand and that Congress can and will and should stop it. And the South is the opposite extreme, that Congress can't do anything about it. To do so is unconstitutional. And so this is kind of the Southern answer to the question of whether or not slavery should be allowed to expand into the territories. It's a very good argument, and you have to hand it to Calhoun. Legally speaking, he has it. But there's a problem here. The North doesn't see it this way. And the property that we're talking about is, of course, human beings. But this is the Southern answer, and we see it in the form of John C. Calhoun's Senate resolutions of 1847. So we have the Northern argument, which is one end of the spectrum. We have the Southern argument, which is the opposite end of the spectrum. And these are polar, far ends here. Is there any middle ground to this answer? Well, in the next year, in 1848, a man by the name of Lewis Cass, who was the Democratic candidate for president in 1848, he came up with a kind of a middle-of-the-road answer to this question of slavery's expansion into the territories. And the name of it is the idea known as popular sovereignty. Popular meaning the people, sovereignty meaning the people are sovereign. The people are the end-all be-all. And what he meant by this idea was he argued to just let the people that actually moved to these territories of the Mexican Cession, let them decide for themselves whether or not that territory should allow slavery or not. And what he was arguing here is that slavery is not conducive to the arid climate of the American Southwest, and that slave owners aren't going to move there. So bottom line for Cass and for people that supported this idea was that just let the people decide. And since slavery is not likely to go here, the whole issue becomes moot. It becomes a non-issue. The idea here for Cass was to calm everybody down, because this question of slavery's expansion was becoming very divisive here in the 1840s. And that was all a result of the Mexican-American War and the acquisition of all these brand new territories of the Mexican Cession. So this question of slavery's expansion, just to review, we see in 1846 as highlighted by the Wilmot Proviso that the North believes Congress should restrict slavery, has the right to restrict slavery, and that slavery is not to expand. That is now a matter of principle for the North. But the next year we saw with John C. Calhoun's Senate resolutions that it's a matter of principle now for the South that slavery has to be allowed to expand. Congress has no say in the matter, And if Congress tries to restrict slavery's expansion, they see this as unconstitutional. But then we get a middle of the road option, an option designed to calm all the emotion down. And that idea is popular sovereignty. Let's let the settlers that move here decide for themselves. Okay, so the expansion of slavery is by far, hands down, the biggest issue here in the 1840s that is creating this sectional crisis. But there were other issues that are worth mentioning. One is controversy over what are known as fugitive slave laws, and that's what we want to talk about next. Okay, guys, when you talk about fugitive slave laws, what you're talking about then is a national law designed to make it easy for slave owners to recapture their runaway slaves. And we have had the United States had a fugitive slave law on the books since the founding of the country. Now here's the thing. When you're talking about runaway slaves in the big picture of American history, you're not actually talking about a whole lot of slaves. It's interesting that slaves tended to not run away, and it wasn't as prevalent as you may have thought. And there's lots of reasons to explain this. A lot of psychoanalytical data has been put out there. I try to stay away from all that. I'll just give you some practical reasons why you didn't see a lot of runaway slaves in American history. Guys, the vast majority of slaves lived in the Deep South. They did not live in the upper South states of, say, Virginia and Kentucky and Tennessee and places like that. They lived down in the Deep South. So for a slave to run away to freedom, they're going to have to cross thousands of miles of territory. They're just not going to make it. Okay? Because it's not like there won't be people out there looking for them. Every county and every single state of the South had slave patrols that went out every night looking for slaves that were running away. If you were living in southern Mississippi and you needed to get to the north or even to Canada to be free, you were never going to make it. Another reason they didn't run away in large numbers is that most of them were illiterate. They could not read. And if you can't read, they couldn't read a map. So they wouldn't even know where to go. Okay? So you're not really talking about thousands or even millions of runaway slaves here in American history. But the issue became a big issue in the 1840s, largely because of symbolism. These were fugitive slave laws that had existed. Again, they required runaway slaves to be returned to their owners. And for years, northern free states had found ways to circumvent these laws. And this, of course, really angered the South. They saw this as northern free states kind of breaking the law and refusing to and denying southern slaveholders their property. Added into all this, with the rise of the abolitionists in the 1830s, the abolitionists had established a network of safe houses that were designed to help ferry away slaves that run away from the South. This network of safe houses, today, or you maybe have heard of before, it's known as the Underground Railroad, which again did not result in millions or even thousands of slaves that run away. What's happening here is it's largely a symbolic issue. Northerners don't like these fugitive slave laws. They tend to ignore them. And then when you add in the abolitionists actually creating a network to help slaves run away, it seemed to the South then that the North was encouraging the running away of slaves and denying Southerners their property. It just looked real nefarious to the South, even though it's not resulting, in millions or even thousands of runaway slaves. To the South, it just looked like the North is ignoring these laws that they should be living up to. And it looked like, from the abolitionist standpoint, it looked like to Southerners, it looked as though Northerners were helping to encourage all of this. Now, I do have to be honest, most Northerners were against these fugitive slave laws because, it's kind of like this. They would have told a Southerner, look, if slavery is your thing, then it's your thing. Don't make us part of your thing. Because under these fugitive slave laws, Northerners were required to go out and find runaway slaves. And that just didn't sit right with a lot of Northerners. If you found a runaway slave, you were then supposed to, by federal law, capture that person and send them back to a life of slavery. That idea did not sit very well with a lot of Northerners. Southerners, of course, took a very different position and said, this is our property, you cannot be depriving us of this. So these arguments began to arise again in the 1840s over the fugitive slave laws. Northerners don't really like them. What Southerners begin to call for is a stronger fugitive slave law, a fugitive slave law that makes it easier for them to recapture their runaway slaves and produces harsher punishments on Northerners that refuse to obey this law. So we, even in the 1840s, have arguments taking place over fugitive slave laws. That wasn't the only issue. There were a few other issues dividing the United States in the 1840s. The next one is slavery and the slave trade in our nation's capital. Northerners hated the fact that if they traveled to our nation's capital, or if foreign dignitaries were traveling to our nation's capital, what these people would have seen are slave auctions at multiple sites in our nation's capital. Here's a depiction of one, and then an actual picture of one in D.C. This was very embarrassing for Northerners. They saw this as just very, very embarrassing. Here was our nation's capital. It was supposed to be this symbol of freedom and of liberty to the world. And if you traveled here, you would have been subjected to slave auctions. You would have been subjected to slavery itself. It just looked awful. This was not supposed to be what the country was about, is what Northerners would have argued. Of course, when they make these arguments, Southerners, of course, push back on this and say, well, this is just what slavery is. This is how it's done. But what you saw here in the 1840s is a big push from Northerners to ban slavery in our nation's capital, but also to ban the slave trade in our nation's capital. Again, it's one of these ideas that Northerners would have said, look, if it's your thing, South, it's your thing. Don't make us have to be privy to it. We also have this issue over slavery and the slave trade in D.C. Northerners want to ban it. Southerners are pushing back on it. A couple other issues dividing North and South during the 1840s. And one of them hits a little closer to home here in Texas, and that's the boundaries of Texas. Guys, when Texas was annexed to the United States, look how big it was. Oh man, this would have been fantastic. The problem with this is that Northerners saw this as Texas just simply being too big. They wanted to see Texas smaller and cut down a little bit. Because a lot of that land that you see here that's not part of Texas today, that was territory claimed by Texas. And Northerners were worried that if Texans, being Southerners, started moving into these territories, that they might begin carving out states. And these states would then be slave states coming into the Union. So in the late 1840s, Northerners began to argue that Texas's borders are too broad, they're too big, they need to be cut down. Of course, Southerners react by saying, well, that's not fair. Texans fought and died for this land. You cannot deprive this land from them. But yet again, here's another issue that North and South are arguing over, and they're arguing over the boundaries of Texas. And one more, and that's California. California was even a sectional issue here in the 1840s. Let me briefly explain. California, which was the far western part of the Mexican Cession, this area right here. This was part of the Mexican Cession that we gained as a result of the Mexican War. Well, guys, in the late 1840s, especially in the year 1849, Americans began pouring into California in record numbers, and that was because of the gold rush of 1849. The point being here is that beginning in the late 1840s, a lot of Northerners wanted California to enter the Union as a free state. But Southerners in Congress, making use of that undue representation as a result of the Three-Fifths Compromise, were able to continuously block the entry of California into the Union. Because if it came into the Union, it would throw off the balance of power. California would come in as a free state. And this was something they were not willing to accept. So even California is dividing the North and South. North wants California in, South wants it to remain out. Now here's the thing about every single one of these sectional issues. They all have a common variable. They are all a result of slavery. Slavery is the common variable in every single one of these issues. Even California and the boundaries of Texas. Slavery is playing this central role in dividing the nation. But these were the sectional issues that were creating the crisis of the 1840s. Now, how did it all play out? Well, In 1850, Southern states meet in Nashville, Tennessee. They held a convention in 1850 of 9 Southern slave states. And at this convention, they all decided that the problems facing the country here in the 1840s are big enough and they warrant satisfaction. And they claim at this Nashville convention in 1850 that unless some type of compromise is reached on these issues that satisfies them, they are already using the claim that they will secede from the Union. So how real was this crisis? Very real. If something doesn't happen to calm everything down, we probably get a civil war breaking out in the year 1850. And we get real lucky. Just as it looked like everything was going to fall apart, we do in fact get a compromise on every single one of these issues that we just talked about. The name of the compromise is known as the Compromise of 1850. And it was Henry Clay, once again, that brokered the compromise. Henry Clay was in his 80s. This guy was ready to die, but they pulled him out of retirement. They believe this is the only guy that can broker a compromise because he'd already done it twice with the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise Tariff of 1833. He's pulled out of retirement again, and he rides again one last time. Henry Clay will sit down with representatives from the northern states and from the southern states, and he will broker this compromise that will seemingly satisfy all of these issues. So let's talk about this compromise. What was in it? Well, as part of this compromise, California is going to enter the Union as a free state. So you can see here that in 1850, California will enter the Union as the 31st state in U.S. history. It comes in as a free state. Okay, we've solved that issue. Well, the slave trade is also going to be banned in our nation's capital. Just the slave trade, not slavery. So if you're a slave owner and you travel to D.C., you can still take your slaves with you, but the slave trade is prohibited. It is abolished, and it is banned forever in our nation's capital. What does that mean? That means that if you went to our nation's capital after 1850, you would not have been subjected to horrible scenes of families being ripped apart, children being ripped from their mothers, husbands and wives being ripped apart. You would not have seen this scene anymore in our nation's capital. North didn't get everything they wanted, but remember, it's a compromise. So the slave trade will be abolished in our nation's capital. Number 3, the South gets a stronger fugitive slave law. What did this do? This new fugitive slave law made it easier to capture runaway slaves, and it made the punishment for people that ignored this law stiffer. This is exactly what the Southerners were calling for. Remember, though, this is largely a symbolic issue. But it was a symbolic victory here for Southerners, so they get a stronger fugitive slave law passed here in 1850. What else was in it? Well, remember we had the dispute over the borders and the boundaries of Texas. Well, as a result of the Compromise of 1850, Texas will accept its smaller present-day borders in exchange for $10 million, in which we will use to pay off our debt that we had accrued during our time as an independent republic. So what were those borders? Well, the borders you know today. And just on an interesting side note, you can see that our panhandle does not stretch above the Missouri Compromise line. That was part of the deal here. Northerners didn't want to have any new state for the South be above that line. So that's why our panhandle ends where it is today. But you can see here that Texas's present-day borders are going to be established under the Compromise of 1850. And the last, and most important, is what do we do then with the rest of the Mexican cession? What happens to it? And more importantly, what about slavery's expansion there? It was decided here under the Compromise of 1850 that what was left of the Mexican cession when you took out California is that the rest of that territory was going to be divided into 2 territories. And the question of whether or not slavery's expansion is going to go here is going to be left up to popular sovereignty. So what happened? Well, you can see that the Utah Territory is created and the New Mexico Territory is created. And the question of whether or not slavery's expansion can occur here, that's going to be left up to the settlers that go here and not the United States Congress. This was the Compromise of 1850. Now, what's significant about it? A couple things. One is that the compromise was viewed by the vast majority of Americans as a solution. It was viewed by most Americans as satisfactory. Okay? The radicals on both sides didn't like it, but you can never please the crazies. The crazies on both sides, you can never please these people. But the vast majority of Americans looked upon this compromise as a good thing because it satisfied virtually everyone. But here's the other reason we care about this compromise. Some historians have said that this compromise may have been the most important event in American history. And here's why. The compromise prevented a civil war from likely breaking out 10 years before it did. Okay, this is in 1850. The Civil War is going to break out in 1861. So the compromise prevented civil war 10 years before it actually did. And here's why we care about that. The differences between North and South were not as severe. They were not as pronounced in 1850 as they would be in 1861. Between 1850 and the beginning of the Civil War was a time of rapid industrialization and a huge population boom in the North. And those two factors that occurred between 1850 and 1861 were vital to bringing about Union victory in the American Civil War. So I guess what I'm trying to say here, and what historians have argued concerning the compromise, is that had the Civil War broke out in 1850, the southern states would have stood a better chance of winning it. And if they had won it, American history and the United States as you know it would be completely different. So we can almost, you can make the case, and many historians do, that this compromise of 1850 may have actually saved the United States. Because when Civil War did come, the differences between North and South were much more pronounced than they were in 1850. I mean, everything would have changed had Civil War broken out here and had the South won. And if you don't get this compromise, the South may have actually stood a better chance of winning. So this was part 3 of Unit 12, in which we covered all the main big issues confronting Americans in the 1840s, all created because of the Texas Revolution and the Mexican-American War, but all the other smaller issues, all of them, of course, the common variable being slavery. And then we discussed how this crisis was a very real crisis and how it was ultimately calmed down and satisfied with the Compromise of 1850. So this concludes part 3. This is the last part of Unit 12. When you're done with this video, go ahead and take the Unit 12 quiz, and I'll see you guys in Unit 13, where we're going to talk about the worst decade in American history.